Having looked at the structure of the psyche and the four functions of consciousness, we now examine the dynamics of the psyche, that is, the basic laws by which the conscious and unconscious relate to one another. Jung conceived of life as a growing or expanding of consciousness out of unconsciousness. We can observe this growth readily in children, from the relatively unconscious newborn, driven by instincts like hunger, pain, and so on. Children spend their first years absorbing information about their surroundings, modelling behaviours they observe in others, while they construct, test, and develop an understanding of the world and themselves. At 6 months old, when a rattle is dropped from the high chair, being out of sight, it no longer exists. Yet somewhere between 8 and 10 months, as Piaget and other developmental psychologists noted, babies learn that when the rattle is dropped, its location has simply changed. The child now actively searches for it. The child's consciousness has expanded. It is now aware of object permanence, that objects in the physical world have continuity, even if self's perception of the object has changed. If you have ever made a statement like, "A few years ago I would have seen things very differently," you are conveying a similar awareness, that your outlook is now broader because you are conscious of more now than you were then. Jung says that consciousness by nature tends to proceed in a one-sided manner. This is because the activity of consciousness is selective. Selection demands direction, but direction requires the exclusion of everything irrelevant. This is bound to make the conscious orientation one-sided. The contents that are excluded and inhibited by the chosen direction sink into the unconscious, where they form a counterweight to the conscious orientation. Becoming conscious of something requires paying close attention to it. Yet the act of paying attention to something is to select that which is relevant, therefore ignoring or making unconscious all that is irrelevant. The one-sidedness Jung refers to is the result of this selection process. We can see, for example, even when a group of people share an experience, each will absorb and interpret the experience a little differently, according to the cognitive functions or mental filters they innately prefer, and their own collection of knowledge, experience, values, and so on. Accordingly, a group of friends chatting about a movie will each recall and emphasize different aspects of the film, even if they all watched exactly the same content at the same time. Consciousness is necessarily biased or one-sided, which is balanced by the counterweight Jung refers to in the unconscious, which includes all aspects of the experience that were not made conscious. This may be information that was overlooked, forgotten, devalued, or repressed. As we can see, the unconscious can be quite a quagmire of stuff we don't know about, yet everything we become aware of originates in the unconscious. Perhaps some of you can now see how Jung's process of enantiodromia operates. This reflects an important aspect of relations between consciousness and the unconscious, referred to as compensation. Jung described the psyche as a self-regulating system that maintains itself in equilibrium as the body does. Every process that goes too far, immediately and inevitably, calls forth a compensatory activity. Without such adjustments, the normal metabolism would not exist, and nor would the normal psyche. Jung further states that, as a rule, the unconscious compensation does not run counter to consciousness, but is rather a balancing or supplementing of the conscious orientation. In dreams, for instance, the unconscious supplies all those contents that are constellated by the conscious situation, but are inhibited by conscious selection, although a knowledge of them would be indispensable for complete adaptation. In other words, in contrast to the Freudian view of the unconscious as the dustbin for our vulgar or depraved urges, Jung saw the unconscious as the natural complement to, indeed the essential precursor of, consciousness. Jung believed it was in the nature of the psyche to seek integration and wholeness. As an interesting aside, Jung also referred to the collective unconscious as the objective psyche. Compensation, then, is the psyche's mechanism for correcting one-sidedness. Borrowing from Newton's third law of motion, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, Jung maintained that whenever life proceeds one-sidedly in any given direction, the self-regulation of the organism produces in the unconscious an accumulation of all those factors which play too small a part in the individual's conscious existence. When we become overly one-sided in our conscious attitude, we become imbalanced, setting up the unconscious energy that will inevitably erupt into consciousness at some point to restore equilibrium. A mild form of compensation is the faux pas, or Freudian slip. We may be trying so hard to be congenial, politically correct, or whatever, that the very thing we were most anxious to avoid saying or doing slips out. At other times, we may do and say things that we later regret and seem totally out of character, as though we were momentarily possessed by some other force. And finally, the too cool persona faux pas, which takes place when we are trying so hard to impress that we quite forget who and where we are. Here, the Australian Prime Minister, on recorded talkback radio, forgets that keeping cool with the host may not serve his role as PM.
Gloria in Warburton. Morning, Gloria. You're through to Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister.
Hiya.
Hi,
Mr.
Gloria.
Abbott,
Hi.
I would like to ask you if you'd like your mother or your grandmother to be in my situation. I'm a 67-year-old pensioner, 3 chronic incurable medical conditions, 2 life-threatening. I just survive on around $400 a fortnight after I pay my rent. And I work on an adult sex line to make ends meet. Now, that's the only way I can do it. I've worked out, and my maths isn't crash hot, that it's going to cost me at least an extra $850 a year with the increases in medical visits and medication. I'm on a number of different medications that may probably increase as my conditions deteriorate. What do you suggest I cut out, Mr. Abbott? Food, electricity, firewood, Christmas, birthday presents to my grandchildren, or should we all just die and get out of your way?
Jung relates the case of a couple who came to see him when the husband, who had always been a morally upright, socially conservative, responsible provider, suddenly disappeared for several days. When his wife quizzed him, he was completely and genuinely unable to recall what he had done during this period. Needless to say, he was utterly beside himself when his bank statement turned up some time later, detailing hundreds of dollars in payments to bars and brothels during this period of amnesia. This is clearly an extreme case. Most of us do not completely lose consciousness when the unconscious erupts. We may do and say things that are later source of humiliation and regret, but if we're skillful, we can also use these events to integrate that which we'd relegated to the unconscious, thus adjusting our conscious perspective toward a more balanced, realistic and complete awareness, integration and individuation. Oddly enough, this is one of the benefits Jung and other analysts recognise in marriage and other loving partnerships. If only by dint of vowing to spend so much time together, in our most intimate relationships, we will inevitably touch each other's sore spots, vulnerabilities and insecurities. And in so doing, we have the opportunity to confront and grow by integrating our unconscious psychological baggage. Yolanda Jacobi, quoting Tony Wolfe, explains, "The conscious mind is always directed toward the adjustment of the ego to the environment. The unconscious, on the other hand, is indifferent to the egocentric purposiveness and partakes of the impersonal objectivity of nature, whose sole purpose is to maintain the undisturbed continuity of the psychic process, hence to oppose all one-sidedness that might lead to isolation, inhibition, or other pathogenic phenomena." As Jung says, Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. By taking stock of reality and owning the totality of self, flaws and virtues, we minimize the dead weight in the personal unconscious, allowing the conscious to sail the waters of the collective unconscious freely and easily. When you know Jung's theory of psychological types and your own Psyche-Type accurately, watching the arising of ego attachment, the debilitation of perjuring self, and resultant dead weight added to shadow, you can make navigating the vicissitudes of life so much easier. Learn Psyche-Type. It will change your life.